Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. What remains when knowledge burns? What happens to the thoughts trapped within pages when fire consumes their vessel? The first time I entered Blackwell Historical Library, I felt something watching me from between the stacks. Not the librarians, they were all occupied at their stations, helping the scattered few patrons who visited on weekday afternoons. No, this was different. A presence that seemed to flow between the towering shelves like invisible smoke. My name is Thomas Winters, and I'd recently started working as a research assistant at the University of Massachusetts. The library had become my second home as I prepared materials for Professor Holloway's upcoming publication on colonial-era mysticism. The Blackwell was perfect for this, housing one of the most extensive collections of pre-revolutionary texts in New England, many dating back to the early 1600s when the first settlements were established. The building itself was almost as old as some of its contents, a Gothic revival structure built in 1837, all weathered stone and oak beams that creaked when winter winds blew. Local history claimed it had been constructed on the site of a former monastery, though most historians dismissed this as town folklore. That first day, I settled at a corner desk near the rare manuscript section, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and time. The afternoon light slanted through stained glass windows, casting prismatic patterns across the worn parquet floor. It was peaceful, productive, until I noticed the whispering. At first, I assumed it was students in a nearby aisle, but when I paused my reading to listen, the sounds would stop. Resume my work, and there it was again, a rhythmic murmuring just below the threshold of comprehension. Like someone reciting text in a language I almost understood. "You'll get used to it," Martha, the head librarian, told me when I mentioned it. She was 70 if she was a day, with silver hair and a tight bun and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Old buildings talk. The Blackwell just happens to be more chatty than most. I laughed it off, but by my third week, I'd grown accustomed to the library's peculiar acoustics. What I couldn't dismiss was the coldness, pockets of frigid air that seemed to linger in specific sections regardless of the heating system's efforts. Or the way certain books would be found misplaced each morning, always the same volumes on mysticism and death rituals, always arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate but incomprehensible. Most disturbing were the shadows. Not the normal play of light and dark, but tall, cowled figures that appeared in my peripheral vision gone when I turned to look directly. Staff joked about the brothers, claiming they were the ghosts of monks who once occupied the grounds, still tending to their sacred texts centuries after death. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not then. Then came the dreams, nightmares of being trapped inside the library, while invisible hands turned pages around me. In these dreams, words crawled off their pages like insects, burrowing into my skin. I'd wake gasping, my bed sheets damp with sweat. Despite this, I was drawn deeper into my research. Professor Holloway was particularly interested in a collection of journals written by Cotton Albright, a minister who'd been excommunicated in 1691 for heretical practices. Albright had documented rituals for what he called the preservation of wisdom through vessel transference, a process he claimed could bind human consciousness to written text. Pure superstition, of course, Holloway assured me, but fascinating as a cultural artifact of religious anxiety in colonial Massachusetts. I wasn't so certain it was mere superstition, not after what happened in the basement archives. I'd been granted special access to examine some of Albright's more fragile manuscripts, stored in climate-controlled conditions below ground level. Working late one evening, alone except for the night security guard who checked in hourly, I found a previously uncatalogued journal hidden within a false cover of another book. The text was written in Albright's hand, but used an encryption method I hadn't seen before. It took hours to decode even a portion, but what I translated chilled me. The binding is complete. 17 souls now reside within these pages, their knowledge preserved beyond mortal constraints. They speak to me from the ink, guiding my hand as I write. More will join them. The monastery's collection grows. We are creating an eternal congregation of minds, freed from death's silence. As I read these words aloud, trying to make sense of them, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized, but now they seemed dimmer, as if something was absorbing their illumination. Between the stacks I saw them clearly for the first time. Figures in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadow, surrounding me in a loose semicircle. They made no sound, no movement, yet I sensed their attention fixed upon me, upon the journal in my hands. I closed the book and they vanished. Opened it again, they reappeared, closer now. The security guard found me huddled in the corner, the journal clutched to my chest. He saw nothing unusual except for my terror. I was escorted out and took a week's leave from my position, blaming stress and lack of sleep. When I returned, Martha took me aside. "You found Albright's binding journal," she said. "It wasn't a question. You knew about it." Her eyes darted to the corners of the room before she whispered, "There are books in this library that aren't just containing knowledge, Thomas. They're containing souls." Before she could elaborate, the fire alarm blared through the building. No one could explain how the fire started. No electrical faults were found, no carelessly discarded cigarettes. One moment the library was quiet, the next, flames were consuming the rare manuscript section with unnatural speed and intensity. As we evacuated, I swear I saw silhouettes moving through the fire, tall, cowled figures carrying armfuls of burning books, seemingly unaffected by the inferno consuming everything around them. And in the midst of the chaos and screaming sirens, I heard the whispering again, louder now, almost jubilant, rising with the flames. 3 days after the Blackwell fire, I stood across the street from the charred skeleton of the building, watching firefighters and investigators pick through the ruins. The outer stone walls remained intact, blackened by smoke but standing firm. The interior, however, was devastated, wooden shelves reduced to ash, centuries of irreplaceable knowledge gone in hours. The official death toll was 0. Everyone had evacuated safely. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that dozens, perhaps hundreds of souls had perished in those flames. "Quite the tragedy," a voice said beside me. I turned to find Professor Holloway. I hadn't seen him since before the fire. He'd been at a conference in Boston. Now he stood gazing at the ruin, his expression unreadable behind round spectacles that reflected the scene. All my research, I began. Not all, he interrupted, producing a familiar leather-bound volume from his messenger bag. I borrowed this from your desk the day before. Thought it might be useful for my presentation. It was Albright's binding journal, the one I'd found hidden in the archives, the one that had summoned the robed figures. You shouldn't have taken that without permission, I said, though relief flooded through me. It's valuable. More valuable than you know, Holloway murmured. I've been searching for this particular text for decades. There was something different about his voice, something that made the hair on my arms rise beneath my jacket sleeves. He'd always been an animated speaker, passionate about his research, but now his words carried a strange cadence, almost like two voices layered atop one another. I'll have you read it. Truly write it, he asked, eyes never leaving the ruined library. I started to translate some passages. Then you understand what Albright accomplished. What the Brotherhood accomplished. I took a step back. Brotherhood, the order of eternal text. Started in Europe in the 1400s, came to the colonies disguised as a monastic order. At last, he turned to look at me. Their mission was to preserve human consciousness beyond death through a process of binding souls to the written word. The autumn wind picked up, carrying the acrid smell of wet ash. In the distance, I heard sirens as another emergency vehicle approached the scene. Well, that's not possible, I stammered, though I remembered the whispering, the shadows moving through stacks. Thomas, you felt it. The presence in the library. The voices in the margins. Holloway smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Every book they treated became a vessel, housing the consciousness of a willing participant who chose immortality over oblivion. The most devoted members of the order became the custodians, remaining partially in our world to protect the vessels. The monks, I whispered. The figures in robes. He nodded. For centuries, they watched over one of the largest collections of bound souls in North America. Until now, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the October air. The fire. Was it an accident? Nothing about the Blackwell has ever been accidental. Holloway tucked the journal back into his bag. I need your help, Thomas. We need to determine if the souls were destroyed in the fire or merely released. That evening, against all better judgment, I agreed to meet Holloway at his home outside Amherst. It was an old Victorian, set back from the road and surrounded by maple trees shedding their autumn colors. Books filled every available surface, stacked on tables, crammed into shelves that reached the ceilings, piled in corners where furniture should have been. My personal collection, he explained, leading me to his study. Many rescued from forgotten places, private auctions. Some from the Order's European chapters before they disbanded. The study was dominated by a massive oak desk covered with papers and curious objects, brass instruments I didn't recognize, small bottles containing dark liquids, a human skull yellowed with age. On the wall hung framed pages of text in languages I couldn't identify. Are these? I couldn't finish the question. Vessels. Some. Not all texts can hold a consciousness. The process is complex, requiring specific materials, inks made with particular ingredients, He removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief. The most successful vessels were created using paper made from the skin of willing donors and ink containing their blood. My stomach lurched. A human skin. Anthropodermic bibliopgy. Not as uncommon as you might think, he gestured to a small book displayed under glass. Particularly devoted members would donate their bodies this way. The ultimate sacrifice for knowledge preservation. I wanted to leave, to dismiss all this as the ravings of an academic whose research had pushed him into delusion. But I'd seen too much at the Blackwell to deny there was something beyond rational explanation at work. Why me, I asked. Why tell me this? Because you've seen them. The custodians responded to you. That's rare, Thomas. They don't reveal themselves to just anyone. Holloway retrieved Albright's journal. And because I need someone who can access the library ruins. Someone with official research credentials. Someone they'll let back into the site. For what purpose? To find out if any vessels survived. And to determine what happened to the souls if they didn't. What Holloway proposed was insane. Sneaking into the cordoned-off library ruins after dark to search for intact texts or evidence of the soul's fate. Yet I found myself agreeing, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. That night, as I prepared to meet him at the site, I received a strange voicemail from Martha, the head librarian. Thomas, don't trust, her voice was tense, frightened. The fire wasn't an accident. It was a release, not a destruction. They wanted out. After centuries trapped in paper and ink, the message cut off in a burst of static. When I tried calling back, the number was disconnected. By the time I reached the library, clouds had obscured the moon, casting the ruins in deeper shadow. Holloway waited by a service entrance, a flashlight in hand, looking more excited than I'd ever seen him. Ready? He asked. As we slipped past the caution tape, I couldn't shake Martha's warning. Nor could I ignore the whispers that seemed to rise from the ash beneath our feet, countless voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding, growing louder with each step we took into the heart of the devastation. And through the broken windows I saw them gathering, robed figures moving through the darkness, their forms more substantial than before the fire, as if they were regaining physical presence. In their shadow hands they carried phantom books that glowed with faint blue light. Professor, I whispered, pointing. Holloway nodded, his face illuminated by his flashlight. The custodian. Protecting what remains, he handed me a pair of gloves. Come, we need to find the central archive. If any vessels survived, they'll be there. As we picked our way through debris, broken shelves, and soaked, charred paper, the whispers grew to a susurration that filled my head. Not frightening anymore, but urgent. Desperate, like hundreds of people trying to tell me something vital all at once. In what had been the central reading room, we found them, dozens of robed figures arranged in a circle, heads bowed over a small pile of intact books. Remarkable, Holloway breathed. Some survived. The nearest figure lifted its cowled head. Within the shadow where a face should have been, I saw only swirling darkness and 2 points of light like distant stars. We've been waiting for you, Thomas Winters, it said in a voice that sounded like rustling pages. We have been waiting a very long time. How do you know my name? I managed to ask, though terror threatened to steal my voice. The figure's star eyes turned to Holloway. He told us. He promised us a new vessel. One that could hold many of us at once. I turned to the professor, confusion and dread building in my chest. What is it talking about? Holloway's face was transformed by a fervent light. Progress, Thomas. The next evolution of the binding process. He reached into his bag and removed not Albright's journal, but a modern syringe filled with dark liquid. The old vessels were limiting. Paper burns, deteriorates. But a living vessel, a human mind prepared to house multiple consciousnesses, that would be revolutionary. Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. You started the fire. Unnecessary release, he nodded. The souls needed freedom from their deteriorating vessels before they could be transferred. And I'm to be their new container. The whispering in my head intensified until it was a roar of countless voices clamoring for attention, for space, for control. As Holloway stepped toward me, syringe raised, the robed figures moved in closer, their shadowy forms shifting like smoke in wind. Don't fight it, Thomas, Holloway said. Think of the knowledge you'll preserve. The wisdom of centuries all within your mind. I backed away until I felt the heat of still smoldering books behind me. Trapped between fire and a fate worse than death, I made the only choice I could. I ran. I fled through the ruins of the Blackwell, pursued by Holloway and the shadowy custodians. My footsteps echoed through charred hallways as I navigated by the dim emergency lights that had survived the fire. Behind me, I heard the professor's voice, alternating between cajoling and commanding. You can't escape them, Thomas. They've chosen you. What an honor to become a living vessel for centuries of accumulated wisdom. The whispering in my head grew louder, more insistent. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of distinct voices now, some pleading, others demanding. I couldn't distinguish words, just the overwhelming sensation of minds pressing against mine, seeking entry. I stumbled down a partially collapsed stairwell into what had been the basement archives. Water from the firefighters' hoses had pooled here, creating a black mirror that reflected the broken ceiling. The smell was overwhelming, wet ash, mold, and something else beneath it all. Something metallic and organic. Blood. The scent of old blood. My flashlight beam revealed walls that had been hidden behind modern shelving. The fire had exposed the original stone, and carved into it were symbols, ancient glyphs and diagrams that seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence in the darkness. I recognized elements from Albright's journal, but these were older, more primitive versions of the binding ritual. I ran my fingers over the cold stone, feeling indentations that couldn't have been made by tools. They were too organic, too fluid, as if the stone itself had once been soft and malleable, shaped by bare hands. The original binding chamber, Holloway's voice came from the stairwell behind me. He descended slowly, the syringe still in his hand. Where the first American vessels were created. You have good instincts, Thomas. You've led us exactly where we need to be. The robed figures filtered into the room like smoke, surrounding me. Up close, I could see that their forms weren't solid, their edges blurred and shifted, as if they existed partially in another dimension. From within their cowls, pairs of light points fixed on me with terrible intensity. Who are they? I asked, playing for time as I looked for another exit. Really? The most devoted members of the order, Holloway explained, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone despite the madness of the situation. Those who volunteered not just their knowledge, but their entire beings to the cause. They allowed their consciousnesses to be bound not to books, but to the library itself, becoming eternal guardians of the collection. And now they need new vessels, I guessed. Not just vessels. Hosts, Holloway stepped closer and I backed against the carved wall. The fire was unexpected. We'd planned a more controlled transition. But now we must act quickly. The freed souls cannot remain unbound for long before they begin to degrade. I asked. Holloway smiled, and for a moment his face seemed to shift, features becoming fluid, eyes multiplying and then merging back into two. I have been hosting 3 consciousnesses besides my own for over 20 years now. Former scholars of the order who guide my research. But I'm aging, Thomas. We need a younger vessel to continue our work. The whispering in my head crescendoed to a deafening roar. I clutched my temples, feeling as if my skull might split open from the pressure of so many minds trying to communicate at once. Stop, I cried out. Get out of my head. Holloway nodded sympathetically. The process is overwhelming at first. The ink will help. It creates the necessary neural pathways to accommodate multiple consciousnesses without madness. He nodded to the nearest custodian, who glided forward and placed a withered hand on my forehead. Its touch was ice gold, seeping into my skin like frost. Immediately the chaos of voices resolved into distinct streams of thought, still foreign and overwhelming, but no longer pure noise. I saw flashes of lives not my own. A woman in 17th century clothing bent over a writing desk, a man in clerical robes tending to shelves of handwritten manuscripts, a young scholar mixing ink in a copper bowl while chanting in Latin. You see, Holloway whispered, such knowledge, such experience, all preserved beyond death. Why me? I gasped, still reeling from the mental intrusion. You were marked from birth, Thomas. Your bloodline traces back to Albright himself. Holloway raised the syringe. The binding ritual works best with those who carry the genetic memory of the original practitioners. As he moved to inject me, a new voice cut through the cacophony in my mind, clearer than the others, familiar. Martha. Fight them, Thomas, her voice urged. Not all of us want this. Some of us were trapped against our will. Some of us want true release. I looked around wildly, but the former librarian wasn't in the room. Then I understood she was one of them now. One of the voices in my head. She must have been taken after leaving me that warning message. Martha, I whispered. The fire was a civil war, her voice explained within my mind. Those who wanted freedom against those who feared it. The custodians prevented true release, keeping us tethered to this plane. Now they seek new prisons of flesh instead of paper. Holloway's expression darkened. You've made contact with the dissenters. Unfortunate. They don't understand the importance of our work. And what work is that? I asked, stalling as I inched along the wall, searching for escape. Knowledge preservation across millennia, he replied. Death is the great destroyer of wisdom. We've overcome it. Imagine human advancement without the setbacks of mortality, each generation building on the accumulated knowledge of all who came before, not just through written records, but through direct consciousness transfer. It sounded almost noble when he put it that way. But Martha's voice cut through again. Ask him about the sacrifices. Ask him about the unwilling. Were all the souls in the library willing participants? I demanded. Holloway's face twitched, a momentary fracturing of his mask. Sacrifices must be made for progress. Some were convinced to contribute. They were murdered, Martha's voice hissed in my mind. Readers who came to the library alone. Researchers who discovered too much. Their souls extracted and bound to text, while their bodies were rendered into paper and ink. Horror washed over me. You're not preserving knowledge. You're imprisoning souls. A matter of perspective, Holloway shrugged. One that you'll appreciate better once you join us. He lunged forward with unexpected speed, the syringe aimed at my neck. I ducked, feeling the needle graze my scalp as I rolled away. But the custodians closed in, their robed forms solidifying as if they were drawing energy from the air itself. My back hit something hard, a fallen bookshelf. I scrambled over it, putting temporary distance between myself and my pursuers. On the other side, I found what must have been the main storage area for the binding ritual, metal tables with leather straps, dried channels for blood collection, and tools I didn't want to identify. Most disturbing was the wall of preserved skins, human hides stretched and treated, ready to be processed into paper. Some were yellowed with age, others disturbingly fresh. You can't escape, Thomas, Holloway called. The souls have already begun to attach to you. Feel them in your mind. They're taking root. He was right, the voices were no longer just sounds in my head. I could feel them settling into my consciousness, their memories intertwining with mine. Centuries of experiences flooding my brain, births, deaths, discoveries, secrets. But Martha's voice remained distinct. The symbols on the wall, they're not just for binding. They're for release too. Every prison has a key. I frantically studied the carvings I'd seen earlier. Among the complex glyphs and diagrams, certain symbols stood out, appearing to vibrate slightly when I focused on them. Touch them in sequence, Martha instructed. The diamond, the spiral, the 3 vertical lines. As Holloway and the custodians surrounded me, I pressed my palm against the first symbol. It burned cold under my touch, like dry ice against skin. Stop him, Holloway shouted, but it was too late. I slammed my hand against the second symbol, then the third. A shockwave of energy pulsed through the room, knocking me to my knees. The custodians wailed, a sound like tearing paper amplified to deafening levels. Their robed forms began to unravel, threads of shadow dispersing into the air. From within their dissolving bodies, shapes emerged, human figures made of pale light, their faces expressing everything from terror to ecstasy. The souls were being released. No, Holloway screamed, but his voice was no longer singular. Multiple voices erupted from his mouth as his body contorted, his skin rippling as if something beneath was trying to break free. We won't go back to the darkness. The souls inside him were fighting to remain bound as others escaped all around us. I crawled toward the exit as the basement filled with light, souls rising like luminous smoke, passing through the ceiling toward freedom. Some paused briefly before me, their features clearing enough to reveal faces. A woman in colonial dress who must have been Martha, a man in wire-rimmed glasses, a young girl clutching a phantom book. "Thank you," Martha's voice whispered, fading as her soul ascended. Behind me, Holloway had collapsed to his knees, his body shuddering violently. The syringe lay forgotten beside him as he clawed at his own face, leaving bloody furrows in his skin. "You've doomed us all to oblivion," he gasped, his voice still a horrifying chorus. "Centuries of knowledge. Lost." Before I could respond, the floor beneath us trembled. The release of so much spiritual energy was destabilizing the already damaged structure. Chunks of ceiling began to fall as the library prepared to collapse entirely. I had seconds to escape. As I ran for the exit, Holloway's agonized screams followed me, the sound of a man being unmade from within, his stolen souls tearing free of their living vessel. I burst through the emergency exit just as the remaining walls of the Blackwell gave way, burying the binding chamber and everything in it under tons of stone and debris. Outside, the night sky was alive with light, hundreds of luminous shapes rising into the darkness, spreading in all directions like dandelion seeds caught in a breeze. Some lingered briefly, forming into human silhouettes that bowed in my direction before dissolving into the stars. I fell to my knees in the grass, my mind quieter now but still echoing with fragments of others' memories. Not all the souls had departed. Some remnant of their knowledge remained imprinted on my consciousness like a shadow. As the last of the lights faded from the sky, I noticed a single book lying in the grass beside me, Albright's binding journal, somehow thrown clear of the collapse. Its pages fluttered open in the night breeze, revealing text that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The last repository of the Order's knowledge. The last vessel. I should have destroyed it. Should have burned it to ash and scattered the remains. Instead, I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands, heavier than it should have been, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. Just in case, I told myself, tucking it into my jacket. Just to make sure this never happens again. But even as I walked away from the fallen library, I felt the whispers beginning again. Fainter now, but growing stronger with each step I took, calling me back to continue the work, to preserve knowledge at any cost. 3 weeks after the Blackwell Library's final collapse, I sat in my apartment surrounded by notes, printouts, and photocopies, the salvaged fragments of my research. The binding journal lay open before me, its pages no longer shifting but now stable, as if it had settled into its new role as the Order's sole surviving repository. Sleep had become a luxury I could rarely afford. When I closed my eyes, I dreamed of libraries burning, of souls trapped in ink, of Holloway's face splitting open to reveal others within. Worse were the memories that weren't mine, glimpses of lives lived centuries ago, knowledge I'd never learned but somehow possessed. I knew how to mix binding ink now. Could recite the incantations needed to transfer consciousness to paper. Could feel the hunger of empty pages waiting to be filled. My phone rang, startling me from a trance-like state I hadn't realized I'd entered. The caller ID showed the university's number. Thomas Winters, I answered, my voice hoarse from disuse. Well, Mr. Winters, this is Dean Harrington. The dean's tone was formal, concerned. We've been trying to reach you for days. There's the matter of Professor Holloway's effects. My hand tightened around the phone. Well, effects? Well, yes. As his research assistant, you're mentioned in his will as the recipient of his personal library and papers. Given the circumstances, the university is willing to store them until you're recovered. The circumstances. A delicate way of referencing the fact that Holloway's body had been found in the ruins, his face frozen in a scream, his brain showing inexplicable patterns of degradation that medical examiners were still trying to understand. I'll come collect them, I heard myself say. Are you certain? It's quite an extensive collection, and given your recent trauma. I'm fine, I insisted. I'll arrange for movers tomorrow. After hanging up, I stared at the binding journal. Holloway's personal library. Books he'd spent decades collecting from around the world. Books that might contain more souls, more knowledge, more power. Stop, I whispered to myself. This isn't you thinking. But wasn't it? Hadn't I always been driven by the pursuit of knowledge? Hadn't I chosen this field precisely because I believed in the preservation of human wisdom? I slammed the journal shut and wrapped it in a cloth, tying it tightly as if that could somehow contain its influence. Then I buried it in the back of my closet behind winter coats and boxes of old college textbooks. That night, for the first time since the fire, I slept without dreams. The next morning, I drove to the university with a sense of purpose. I would collect Holloway's academic materials, but decline his personal library. I would complete my research using conventional sources, earn my degree, and put this nightmare behind me. Dean Harrington met me at the faculty office building, his face a mask of professional sympathy. How are you holding up, Thomas? Better, I lied. Taking it day by day. He nodded, then led me to a storage room where boxes of Holloway's office contents had been packed. His academic papers are here. The personal library is a separate matter. It's being held at a university storage facility until you decide what to do with it. I thanked him and began sorting through the boxes, looking for anything relevant to my thesis. Most contained standard academic materials, journals, conference proceedings, student papers. Nothing unusual. Then I found a box containing Holloway's personal journals. Dozens of leather-bound volumes spanning over 30 years. I opened the most recent one, dated just weeks before the fire. The preparations are nearly complete. The vessel has been identified and is responding to initial contact. The custodians grow restless. They sense the deterioration of their bound companions and fear their own dissolution if the transfer is not completed soon. T.W. shows remarkable receptivity to their presence. His bloodline serves him well. My hands trembled as I read my initials. How long had Holloway been planning to use me? Since he hired me as his assistant. Since I enrolled at the university. I flipped back through earlier journals, finding references to me dating back 5 years, well before I'd even applied to the university's graduate program. Located another Albright descendant. This one shows more promise than the previous candidates. Have arranged for a scholarship offer to be sent from the history department. The bloodline must be cultivated properly. Cold dread settled in my stomach. Nothing in my life had been coincidence. My academic interests, my university selection, my assignment to Holloway, all had been orchestrated to bring me to the Blackwell Library. I shoved the journals into my bag and quickly finished sorting through the remaining boxes, taking only what I needed for my research. As I was leaving, Dean Harrington stopped me. "There's one more thing," he said, holding out a small wooden box. "This was in Professor Holloway's desk, marked with your name." The box was old, its surface carved with familiar symbols, the same ones I'd seen on the walls of the binding chamber. I took it with reluctance, feeling a strange warmth emanating from the wood. "Thank you," I managed, tucking it under my arm. "And what about his personal library?" "Over 3,000 volumes. Quite valuable, I understand." I hesitated, feeling a pull of desire that wasn't entirely my own. "I'll need to think about it." Back in my apartment, I set the wooden box on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before working up the courage to open it. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a key, ancient iron, its surface etched with the same symbols as the box. Beneath the key was a folded note in Holloway's handwriting. "Thomas, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong with our transition. The key opens a door in my home library, the real library hidden behind the public one. Inside you'll find everything you need to continue our work. The vessels await their new custodian. You have always been meant for this. The voices in your head confirm it." I crumpled the note and threw it across the room. "No," I said aloud. "I won't be part of this." But even as I spoke, I felt the whispers intensify, as if my rejection had agitated them. The crumpled note seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm on the floor where it had landed. "I won't be part of this," I repeated, more firmly this time, but my fingers were already closing around the iron key, its cold metal warming to my touch like a living thing. That night my dreams were more vivid than ever. I stood in an endless library, shelves stretching to infinity in all directions. Each book pulsed with a faint glow, and when I passed my hand over them, they whispered their contents to me, secrets of alchemy, forgotten languages, mathematical formulas centuries ahead of their time. At the center of this impossible library stood Holloway, but not as I had known him. His form was translucent, shifting between his own appearance and those of others, men and women from different eras, all speaking with one voice. "You cannot fight what you are, Thomas," the composite being said. "The knowledge seeks preservation. It will find a way, with or without your consent." I woke gasping, dawn light filtering through my blinds. On my nightstand lay Albright's journal, which I distinctly remembered hiding in my closet the night before. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The library at 42 Oakwood Drive awaits its custodian. Holloway's address. I showered and dressed mechanically, as if on autopilot. Some part of me was screaming to ignore the message, to burn the journal, to flee the city entirely. But another part, growing stronger by the hour, was curious. What knowledge had Holloway collected? What secrets waited in his hidden library? Just to understand what I'm dealing with, I rationalized as I got into my car. Knowledge is power, and I need power to fight this. Holloway's house was a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, its stone facade weathered by decades of neglect. Yellow police tape crossed the entrance, but I found myself pulling it aside without hesitation. The front door was unlocked as if expecting me. Inside, the house was a temple to bibliophilia. Every wall in every room was lined with bookshelves. Tables overflowed with stacked volumes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather binding. The public collection impressive but ultimately mundane. I moved through the rooms, drawn by an unseen force toward a door at the back of the main floor. It was disguised as part of the shelving, visible only because I somehow knew exactly where to look. The iron key slid into the lock with perfect precision. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung inward to reveal a spiral staircase descending into darkness. As I stepped onto the first stair, lights flickered to life below, not electric, but a soft, organic luminescence emanating from glass globes that contained what looked like fireflies suspended in amber. The basement library was smaller than I expected, but infinitely more disturbing. Instead of traditional bookshelves, the walls were lined with glass cases containing books that defied conventional description. Some had covers made from materials I couldn't identify, substances that seemed to breathe and shift. Others were bound in what I now recognized as human skin, their spines tattooed with names and dates. At the center of the room stood a pedestal with an empty glass case, sized perfectly for Albright's journal, which suddenly felt heavy in my pocket. "Welcome home, custodian," whispered a chorus of voices. The air around me shimmered as translucent figures materialized, not the menacing robed custodians from the Blackwell, but more human apparitions. Scholars and librarians from across centuries, their forms less solid than reflections on water. "We are what remains," explained an elderly woman in Victorian dress. "Those who chose to stay. Those who believe in the mission." "Which is what exactly?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "To preserve what would otherwise be lost," said a man in what appeared to be medieval garb. "Not just knowledge, but wisdom. Experience. Humanity's greatest achievements and deepest insights." A younger woman stepped forward, or glided, rather. "You've been fighting us because you only saw the corruption of our purpose. The order began with noble intentions, Thomas. Over centuries, some factions became zealous, cruel. They forgot that preservation should serve life, not replace it. But you still want to possess me," I countered. "To take over my mind." "Not possession," corrected an ancient-looking man with a long beard. "Symbiosis. We offer our knowledge freely, asking only for a temporary vessel to help organize and record it properly. When our work is done, we wish for release, not imprisonment." I circled the room, studying the collection. "And what about these?" I gestured to the skin-bound books. "Were these people willing participants in your noble cause?" The spirits exchanged uncomfortable glances. "The sins of our more fanatical brethren," admitted the Victorian woman. "We do not defend these actions. Indeed, we wish to undo them. Help these souls find proper release. But we need a living custodian to perform the rituals." Convenient, I muttered. The signs were already within you, Thomas, said the medieval scholar. The dreams, the whispers, the knowledge you couldn't possibly possess, yet somehow do. Your mind is uniquely attuned to our frequency. Because of my bloodline, I said bitterly. Because Holloway manipulated my entire life. Yes, the woman acknowledged, but also because you genuinely care about knowledge preservation. Your thesis studying methods of knowledge transmission across generations, it wasn't just implanted by Holloway. That passion was yours. She was right. Even before Holloway's influence, I'd been fascinated by how civilizations preserved their wisdom. How fragile human knowledge could be, and how resilient. What happens if I walk away? I asked. Some of us will fade, said the bearded man. Others will find ways to persist, but in increasingly corrupted forms. The knowledge we carry, much of it exists nowhere else now. Techniques lost to time. Languages no living person remembers. Medical treatments forgotten for centuries. And if I help you, you become the final custodian, said the Victorian woman. You help us transcribe our knowledge into modern formats. You perform the proper rituals to release those souls trapped unwillingly in binding. When our work is complete, perhaps a decade, perhaps less, we will all seek our final rest, leaving you with the knowledge but returning your mind fully to yourself. It sounded almost reasonable when she put it that way. But I remembered Holloway's madness, his body hosting multiple consciousnesses for decades. I need time to think, I said, backing toward the stairs. Of course, they agreed, their forms already fading. But not too long. Without a custodian, the collection will begin to degrade. Back in my apartment, I paced for hours, arguing with myself, or perhaps with the fragments of others already lodged in my psyche. I pulled out my research notes, reviewing everything I knew about the binding ritual and its history. The original purpose had indeed been nobler. In an age before reliable writing materials, when knowledge was primarily oral, the first practitioners had volunteered their consciousness as living repositories. Only later did the practice become corrupted, with unwilling victims and permanent binding. The phone rang at midnight, Dean Harrington again. Thomas, I've been reviewing Holloway's records. There's something you should know. His voice was tight with concern. Your scholarship wasn't ordinary. It was funded by something called the Albright Foundation, a private entity with almost no public footprint. I've found similar scholarships going back decades, all to students who later worked with Holloway. All descendants, I murmured. What? Nothing. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up before he could ask questions. In the morning, I made my decision. I would become the custodian, but on my terms. I would help release the unwilling souls and preserve the willing one's knowledge, but I would not give myself over completely, as Holloway had done. I gathered supplies according to instructions that seemed to appear in my mind fully formed: rare herbs, special inks, silver implements. I modified the binding ritual, incorporating elements of the release symbols I'd seen at the Blackwell. When night fell, I returned to Holloway's hidden library with Albright's journal and my adapted tools. The spirits were waiting, more numerous now, dozens of translucent figures from across history. I accept the role, I announced, but with conditions. I will be custodian, not vessel. You may share your knowledge, but not possess my consciousness. And our primary mission will be releasing those who were taken unwillingly. The spirits conferred among themselves, their whispers like pages turning. Agreed, said the Victorian woman finally. Though it will make the work slower, more difficult. Then let's begin. I placed Albright's journal on the pedestal and opened it to the first blank page. Using the special ink I'd prepared, free of human components, I began to write, guided by the spirit's collective knowledge. The first ritual was the hardest. I selected a skin-bound volume that radiated pain and resentment. As I performed the modified release ritual, the book began to smoke, its pages fluttering violently. A scream tore through the room as a tortured soul ripped free of its binding, its form briefly materializing, a young woman in 18th century clothing, before dissolving into peaceful motes of light. One by one, I worked through the unwillingly bound. Some had been trapped for centuries, their consciousness fragmented almost beyond recognition. Others were more recent victims, including Martha from the Blackwell, whose soul had been partially bound to a small journal despite her resistance. Between releases, I transcribed the knowledge of the willing spirits. Their memories flowed through me like water, pooling in my consciousness before I channeled them onto paper. Ancient languages, forgotten histories, scientific insights lost to time, all preserved without the horror of forced binding. Weeks became months. I rarely left Holloway's house except for supplies. My academic career was on indefinite hold. What was a doctoral thesis compared to this work? I grew thinner, paler, but my mind expanded with each passing day. I could now read texts in languages dead for millennia, understand mathematical concepts that had eluded modern scholars, recall historical events as if I had witnessed them firsthand. The spirits kept their word. They shared but did not possess. When their knowledge had been properly recorded, many chose to depart, their forms dissolving with expressions of profound relief. Others remained to help with the more complex transcriptions, but even they grew less substantial over time. On the anniversary of the Blackwell fire, I performed the final release ritual. The last unwilling soul, a 17th century scholar who had discovered the order's secrets and been punished for his curiosity, ascended with a bow of gratitude. All that remained were 5 spirits who had chosen to stay until the end, ensuring every fragment of their collective knowledge was preserved. Our work is nearly complete, said the Victorian woman, now barely visible even in the dim light. You have been a true custodian, Thomas. Better than any before you. What happens now? I asked, looking around the transformed library. The skin-bound books were gone, replaced by modern archival materials containing the same knowledge without the spiritual imprisonment. Now we complete the circle, said the medieval scholar. We offer you a choice. The bearded ancient stepped forward. You can release us, and we will take the last fragments of our consciousness with us. You will retain the knowledge you've gained, but the direct connection to our experiences will fade over time. Or, I prompted, sensing there was more. Or you can become what the order always intended, said the Victorian woman. Not a vessel hosting unwilling souls, but a true bridge between past and future. You would preserve not just our knowledge, but our essence, not through binding, but through voluntary symbiosis. I would still be myself. Always, she assured me. But with our perspectives as additional resources. A committee of advisors in your mind, not puppet masters. I considered carefully. The months of work had changed me. I was no longer the frightened, manipulated graduate student who had fled the Blackwell Library. I had witnessed both the horror of corrupted binding and the beauty of willing knowledge preservation. What about future generations? I asked. If I accept this symbiosis, what happens when I die? You would train a successor, explained the medieval scholar. Someone who chooses this path willingly, with full understanding. The cycle would continue, but never again through force or deception. I thought of the students who would pass through the university in the coming years. How many would share my passion for knowledge preservation? How many would, if given the chance I never had, choose this path freely? I accept, I said finally, not just for your sakes, but for the knowledge itself. It deserves better guardians than it has had. The ritual was simple. No blood, no binding ink, no imprisonment. Just an opening of mental doors that had been ajar since birth, allowing the remaining spirits to settle into corners of my consciousness where they fit naturally. When it was complete, I stood alone in the library, yet not alone. My mind felt like a vast cathedral, echoing with whispers of the past that no longer fought for control, but offered their wisdom when called upon. I gathered the most crucial texts, including Albright's journal, now filled with properly preserved knowledge, and left Holloway's house for the last time. The hidden library had served its purpose. Now the knowledge needed to rejoin the world, carefully and ethically. 3 months later, I defended my doctoral thesis. Knowledge embodied, ethical approaches to living archives in the digital age received the highest honors and immediate publication offers. No one but me knew that its insights spanned centuries of collected wisdom. I accepted a junior faculty position at the university. As the new caretaker of the anthropology department's special collections, I began the slow process of integrating the preserved knowledge back into academic discourse, one careful publication at a time. At night, in my small campus office built atop the former site of the Blackwell Library, I sometimes sensed other presences, unbound souls drawn to the work we were doing. Not all knowledge had been preserved. Not all souls had found release. The work would continue for my lifetime and beyond. In the top drawer of my desk, a small leather-bound journal waited. Its pages contained the true history of the order of the bound page, the proper rituals of release, and criteria for identifying a worthy successor when the time came. On its cover, embossed in silver ink that seemed to shift in certain lights, was a simple title, Pages of Flesh, a custodian's guide to ethical knowledge preservation. I ran my fingers over the embossing, feeling the slight warmth of the ink. Not binding ink, nothing would ever be bound unwillingly again, but ink nevertheless imbued with purpose. "We begin again," I whispered to the empty office. And from the corners of my mind, 5 distinct voices answered in harmony, and this time we do it right. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing and good night.